only question that goes unanswered is usually one that is unasked. So part of the reason for this approach is as I traversed around doing the training and getting a chance to interact with different environments, I found there a need for the individuals who I thought had greater and more compelling testimonies of the actual practicality of Christ at work. Now, as an evangelist, as a theologian or whatever, when you stand up in front of people, I get an opportunity to preach or teach or do all of those things. That's different. I'm called as a communicator. But what about those that are not called as communicators but have a better story to tell? In fact, their example is one that deserves to be heard. That actually teaches better. Even the good book said, through parable taught he them, without parable taught he them not. So what we are sharing with you are real life parables. These are actually examples of faith, a faith of, that mustard seed proportion that mushrooms into impact. So when we sit with people and when we go through that process. So how many of you are familiar with the gentleman, Dr. Ravi Zacharias? So most of you know his name. For those of you who don't, there's a packet of information they were gracious enough to send. There is one CD in there that is from many, many years ago. It's called Is There Not a Cause? As far as communicators go, he is probably one of the best in terms of what he does and how he does it. But the arenas which he reaches, you and I will never reach, just because of the fact that he had a 40-year head start. The 40-year head start began with leaving Trinity as a student and going to Cambodia and going from camp to camp. And they all have stories, and you'll meet modern-day evangelists who have crisscrossed the globe, and I've been privileged to know many of them and serve with them in a personal level on the front line. But why I got fascinated with this part is his is a global ministry that actually deals interculturally, but more importantly, cross-generationally. They are creating answers for the F generation that is coming up, what Gary Hamel wrote in Harvard Business Review, Generation F, the Facebook generation. Just yesterday, having a conversation with my son, I began to realize, here's a boy who was raised in the church. 4 years later, he comes out with a degree. He graduates debt-free. He has honored dad and mom in everything dad and mom has honored. But his brain has been filled with a lot of mush from the liberal world. And that's not good, bad, or indifferent. That's all he knows. His worldview has drastically changed to moving away from a conservative evangelical position to the why not component. Gary Hamel, when he put up his rules, here are the 15 things that Generation F believes. The 15th point is what scared me more, when they believe hackers are heroes. And the concept is, we have reached a point, the tipping point, where absolutes have now been jettisoned. And this whole seductive, open-ended thought process is beginning to evolve. So ultimately, emotion, Mr. Ziegler used to say, when will meets imagination, put your money on imagination. Amen. As a result of that, how do we now revert back to the thing? So logic becomes our last line of defense when we are presenting a coherent argument, and logic becomes that, hey, let's look at it logically as the outworking of this. So pull him up on YouTube. Just type in Ravi Zacharias' view on homosexuality, for example. Whether it's an issue or not is not the issue. The issue is, how do you confront it in an argument? He positions it this way. He says, well, in order to answer the question, I have to basically get your permission to create 3 different definitions of the constructs of society. Will you give me that liberty? Now, if you want me to deal with a toxic subject, I need to be given an opportunity to put my position forward. He says we are no longer a theonomous culture where we believe that our opinions come from God. Heteronymous cultures would be, theonomous cultures in modern day would be maybe Marxism of some kind, where they evolve in some way. Heteronymous cultures would be where we raise up people to give our worldview to us. The caliphates of modern day Islam would be heteronymous cultures. Hinduism is probably the last remnant of a theonomous culture, which even though they don't take their edicts from God, they invoke God in everything they do, unable to define that God. Marxism would be a heteronymous culture where a select few determine what's needed. So he positions this. Now suddenly what's happening is we are no longer evangelical bumpkins just saying Jesus saves. There is an intellectual discourse behind it. E. Stanley Jones put it best when he said, we have inoculated the world with a mild form of Christianity, so it's practically useless against the real thing. So that's where we have to, so that's why I said, okay, why can't we make it a little more intellectual without being heady? And that's where he comes in. He actually fills that gap in a very, very unique way. The third position, he says, is, are we heteronymous? The person said no. He says, so you would then agree that we are an autonomous culture, which means we have self-evolved to the point where we believe that my individual flowering of thought deserves a reasonable hearing in the court of public opinion. I agree. You think we're an autonomous culture? Well, most of our decisions have now arriving that way. He said, so can I now ask you a question? Since you have arrived at your opinion in an autonomous way, will you give me the luxury of an autonomous response? Or the moment I respond, will you say, no, we are a heteronymous culture, that law has already been passed? Which means the argument fails on the fundamental premise in which it was offered, saying, I want your opinion to validate mine, I don't want your opinion. This is where we are failing, and that is why we bring apologetics into the equation. So he gives us a really good thing. It's called the three things that every worldview that you deal with, from Buddhism to Sikhism to Hinduism to Jainism, from humanism to secularism, from atheism to agnosticism, all worldviews have to answer these three primary moods. Is it logically consistent? And historically, when you look at the gospel of Jesus Christ, and even if you evaluate the four Gospels in the New Testament and put them over each other and say, let's take the errors out of it or the contradictions out of it, there is almost a 99% certainty in what the story tries to tell. The fact that they tell it differently is only because they were different audiences, but it is the only worldview that is logically coherent throughout the history of time. If you want to read the resurrection of Jesus Christ proved outside of the Bible, read Gary Habermas's thesis, which is on GaryHabermas.com. Gary Habermas was a PhD student at Michigan State. He said he wanted to do his PhD on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They said, you can't say the Bible says so. So he proves the resurrection of Jesus Christ outside of the Bible, the most definitive thesis, one of the greatest arguments. In fact, go online and hear Gary Habermas's conversation with Anthony Flew, a lifelong atheist who later became a deist. Very powerful stuff. And we will provide through Witness at Work all these links. You will have a background of information, and we will be one email away from inundating you with information, so you are never short of the information to make a logical defense, but to do it meekness and humility. Logical consistency. Empirical adequacy. Does it actually pan out? Okay, let me read this for you. Whether Hitler or Hugh Hefner, religious or irreligious, everyone has a worldview. A worldview basically offers answers to four necessary questions. We'll talk about that. Taking it a step further, the three tests for truth must be applied to any worldview: logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and experiential relevance. When submitted to these tests, the Christian message is utterly unique and meets the demand for truth. Consider the empirical test of the person, teaching, and work of Jesus Christ. A look at human history shows why he was who he claimed to be and why millions follow him today. In fact, none other except Jesus even claimed to be a divine Savior. His offer of grace and forgiveness by being the perfect sacrifice of our is profound. Now look at the sequence, okay guys? This is, and ask other worldviews if they have something that will balance it out. In the world that we talk about, the so-called free love movement that we experience now, after all, every ism and schism that has been offered, as Dr. Ravi himself puts it, he says the only thing that is illegitimate in America today is prejudice. If you can bring anything down to prejudice, you jettison the morality and then you now invoke the civility. The moment you invoke civility, it is easier to brand you a bigot rather than a religious zealot. A religious zealot may have something to do with upbringing and conviction, but a bigot is just condition. So it's very easy to point you in that way. So when you look at it, they say love. Okay, let's take your love. And here's how he puts it. Love is the supreme ethic. They'll say, Where there's the possibility of love, there must be the reality of free will. If you love to be something that you were not created to be, if that is my evangelical argument, and your evolved argument is, hey, science has proven that it's not a choice, it's actually something that happens, whatever that, I'm not going there. But if you claim that you have a desire to be loved, there is a percentage of the population that will reject your love because they think opposite to you. So wherever there is love, there is free will. Now, wherever there is free will, there inevitably will be the possibility of sin. Banks have money. I have free will to go and put my money in the bank, but I also have free will to rob it. So wherever there is love, there has to be free will, logically. Wherever there is free will, there inevitably will be sin. Wherever there is sin, there is need for a Savior. Wherever there is a Savior, there is hope for redemption. Only in the Judeo-Christian worldview does this sequence find its total expression in the answer of Jesus Christ. The story from sin to redemption is the only in the gospel with the ultimate provision of a loving God. No other worldview offers that. Now, why do we say worldview and not religion? The word religion has become toxic. The word relationship seems a cop-out. I met a lot of evangelical Christians, and these are what Dr. Ramesh, whose son is back there, Ryan, Dr. Ramesh always says that these are what you call, they're Christians who are just adorned for the purpose. They wear all the trinkets necessary to be the representative of Christ in the way they look. They're adorned for that purpose. But they can't defend it. Because at the end of the argument, they're failing the very equation. This whole concept of trying to understand why we need logic is going by the wayside for the simple reason that I remember one guy coming and telling me, he said, but that's so hard. We have reduced evangelical opportunity and free will to the point of imbecility that most people think that it is so intellectually devoid of any foundation. I don't want to have anything to do with it. You're a bunch of yahoos. They cling to their Bibles and their guns. A statement like that was not considered toxic. It's almost a reality now. We are laughed at. You know, many of you have heard me always say, people ask me, do I believe the Bible? I said, I believe the Bible from Genesis to maps. And people say, well, what do you mean Genesis to maps? Doesn't it end at Revelation? Yeah, emotionally it does. Logically, all the problems in the world are about the maps. Maybe you need to study them. They're not put there so Thomas Nelson had even pages. Paul's journeys mattered. Thomas ending up in India mattered. So we have to look at it. And then the third component, experiential relevance. We're the only ones who have those commandments. We were given an order. Now I want you to watch this carefully, okay? Why traditional worship has not answered these questions for the believer. Especially Western. We were asked this question, Brad was asking me this question the other day. I've traveled to India, I think since I was saved, my last trip to India was my 55th trip. Okay, so I put a little miles between here and there. But in India, I always ask this question, which model of American church do you want revived? And they say the one of the 30s. Because not only did you send, you stayed. What we have now is short-term halo missions. Most people wondering why they are targeted. For Christ's sake, literally Christ's sake, if you're on a mission trip, stop wearing a yellow t-shirt that says I'm on a mission trip. You already look like a Q-tip in a very dark country. Okay, you're going to stand out like a banana, and you're not only going to get mugged, you're going to get persecuted. Common sense is defeated in the short term. What do short-term halo missions do? They give you the ability on social media to tell people you went on a mission trip. Brad and I follow a guy by the name of Church Curmudgeon. If you've never seen an old guy tweet, follow this guy on Twitter, Church Curmudgeon. One of his favorite tweets of all time. I love this one. He says, I remember a time when the pastor's wife was large and the church was smoking hot. So he's quite brilliant, but he says the reason we call it a selfie is this generation is too lazy to spell narcissistic. But it's short-term halo adjustment. So when you look at the experiential relevance, what I'm talking about is look at the totality. Read the stories of Adoniram Judson. Read the stories of Henry Martin. Read the stories of Brainerd. Read the story of Amy Carmichael. People who gave 50 years to the field. And that should inspire us in our corporate endeavor. When you see someone who has created divots in the floor, when you see a David Livingston dead, bent, praying, and the native saying, hey, you know what? He instructed that his heart be left in Africa. So the body sans heart was sent back around the Cape. 11 months it took before it got its burial place in Westminster Abbey. These are true people. There is an experiential. No other worldview sends people as an edict. In fact, we paid the price as a family. I've been absent most of my boys growing up. Been out flapping my gums. But Anila had something profound to say. She said, when a man of God is called to do the work of God, he's immortal till God calls him home. That's why I don't worry. Does she really worry? Of course. She's going to miss the physical company, and then there'll be financial problems. I mean, all of those things you have to worry. But you cannot ever worry of the messianic call. When a man of God is doing the work of God, he's immortal. So in the businesses, what's the worst they can do? No? Well, in sales, we have a term. If you ask for something you've never had and they say no, you break even. You can't lose. So why do we complicate it? We complicate it because we have missed the thread, the messianic thread. See, when you look at the Bible, experiential relevance, first, the people had to be redeemed. They had to be taken out of a place and brought to another place, and they had to wander for a period of time. That actual journey takes about 11 days. There's no way it could take 40 years even without GPS. If you just walk in a straight line, you'll get there in 11 days. 40 years. First, they had to be redeemed. Then they got the commandments. He had to go up into the mountain, and he had to come face to face with God, and he came down with the tablets. They had to be made righteous. And only then was worship added in the tabernacle. We do it backwards. We first build a place of worship, call them in to be righteous, and hope they're redeemed. Complete backwards. This experiential relevance proves to us that Christian worldview from the very gestation of the Bible tells us that first we have to be a people that is redeemed. We have to separate ourselves now that we are prisoners of the Lord. How then shall we live a life worthy of that calling? Separate yourself. We first have to be redeemed. What is different about you in the marketplace? What is different about you in the business place? Now, to some, memory of Scripture comes easy. To others, it's more difficult. That's not what I'm talking about. God has given everybody some amount of talent. He's given some more than others, but He's not left anyone without any. But once you go through that process, we begin to realize, once you set yourself as a prisoner of the Lord, and you accept this calling, then something begins. So that's that experience. So the Bible is the only one, and you have to ask people who come from different worldviews. Is what you're talking about logical? I'm a former Hindu. Hinduism is a pantheistic religion. It has got 300 million gods because they believe in reincarnation and transmigration. Reincarnation means I could come back as somebody. Transmigration, I could come back as something. As a result, everything is sacred, everything is pious. Tradition occupies life. And when you abdicate Hinduism to become a Christian, they say you abandoned your culture. You didn't just give up your identity. You didn't just give up your belief. You abandoned your culture. It's a big, big stigma. So when you stand in front of them and say that I am now a Christian, they almost consider you narrow-minded because you just want one God. We got 300 million. I mean, how dumb can you be? When I stand up and then make a statement, I said tradition can never be strategy. It's only tradition. I asked my mother one time, I said, Mom, why do you take the coconut in your right hand and hit it on this particular stone in this corner of the temple? You know the grand theology she gave me? She said, because I can't break it on your head. Her mom told her to do that, her mom's mom told her to do that, and she's just breaking the coconut in that corner. Tradition can never be strategy. So challenge any person who has a different worldview. Well, I'm exploring Buddhism. Do you know Buddha gave up Hinduism? Really? They don't know that. So there's a good book out there. It's called Jesus Among Other Gods. Jesus Among Other Gods. And that'll be a good book to read in that realm. So look at these three, and we have, again, a lot of resources on this. We'll have some video clips on this with different people articulating the same thought process. Hopefully we did a little bit of justice to it. Now, once you have the three basic tests for truth, you have to have what we call the four fundamental questions that need to be answered. Origin, morality, purpose, and destiny. No matter what you believe, no matter if you believe, no matter that you believe, you will have it has to pass these four lenses. Where do I come from? Where am I going? Origin, destiny. What am I doing here? Meaning. And is there a right and a wrong purpose? Morality. When you look at postmodern thinking, this is the one where the biggest rub is. Isn't it all relative? Well, relativism is a crock. It has never been proven to have any substance, except in public debate. In the privacy of a home, a father sitting around with his daughter, and the daughter says, Dad, you're just so narrow-minded. I'm just relatively pregnant. Yeah, 9 months from now, that family is in for a relative surprise. You know, some things are right, some things are wrong. But relativism is a crock. It has no bearing. It will never hinge. G.K. Chesterton, beware of a fence you drop if you never asked yourself why it was up there. How did Muggeridge put it? Muggeridge said, the depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable, but at the same time the most intellectually resisted. The depravity of man. This is something else we, I can find this. Okay, here's on the final conclusion of civilization. This is Muggeridge in Religion and Society. So far, the final conclusion would surely be that whereas other civilizations have been brought down by attacks of barbarians from without, ours had the unique distinction of training its own destroyers at its own educational institutions and then providing them with facilities for propagating their destructive ideology far and wide, well at the public expense. Thus did Western man decide to abolish himself, creating his own boredom out of his own affluence, his own vulnerability out of his own strength, his own impotence out of his own erotomania, himself blowing the trumpet that brought the walls of his own city tumbling down, and having convinced himself that he was too numerous, labored with pill and scalpel and syringe to make himself fewer. Muggeridge is one of the most prolific writers you'll ever read. Until at last, having educated himself into imbecility and polluted and drugged himself into stupefaction, he keeled over a weary, battered old bronchosaurus and became extinct. Self-inflicted. Not by the dumb, not by the uneducated, but every modern morass we have seen came from the very highest levels of academia. If you haven't read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl and seen his struggle in Auschwitz and Treblinka, in the concentration camps, Viktor Frankl is the one who coined the term logotherapy, became a psychiatrist of great eminence in Austria, died in his 90s. His daughter now publishes his work. Here was a man who was touring America and could have very easily stayed in America. He says, no, familial obligation forces me to go back. He went back to Austria, was rounded up by the Nazis. 22 of his family members died in the Holocaust, including a wife with a child and a dad. Here was a man who came up with that. He says, what I observed there was those who had pride survived. Those who succumbed to the propaganda began to participate in debauchery and evil. Logotherapy, the power of words. He said, and this I also found out, that the design to create a perfect race was not the whims of a madman that we call the Austrian with an idea and an ideology. The desire to do this was actually framed in the very halls of intellectual academia, who by day taught our children, and by night sipped sherry and port to the music of Wagner. When you tell that in the university, they cringe. They don't believe they're doing that. But that's boundaryless thinking. Boundaryless thinking, they don't actually believe they're doing anything wrong. Remember what I started with. It's only relevant if it's prevalent. They don't look at it through the lens of history. It's only relevant if it's prevalent. What are you talking about, Auschwitz? You know what the biggest debate about Auschwitz now is whether it was actually 1.6 million at Auschwitz or whether it was closer to 980. One is too many for that cause. When you hear Hannah Arendt write about the banality of evil when she covered the Nuremberg trial, you'll begin to understand what I'm talking about. When this guy says, I don't want to bow my head down, I want to go to the gallows, long live Austria, long live Argentina, I have loved you all. When he was questioned later, Hess, he says that we found the solution to the Jewish problem, the Zenon tablets. You know why they went with mass extermination? Because the guards were complaining that their conscience was being bothered to look at the eyes of the Jews they had to shoot. Banality of evil. Propagated by academia. Final solution. Eugenics. Margaret Sanger. This is what we're confronting. So these four have to be answered. Where do you come from? If a person says, I went from goo to zoo to you, their self-image is already shot. Now, it's not a young earth and old earth. Do you really believe that? See, that's a ridiculous argument. They always want to frame it in stuff that has no bearing. I'm not talking about young earth, old earth. I'm talking about, do you believe that everything has a first cause, and that first cause has to have been created by something outside of its own creation? I do. That gives me self-image. Now, the Bible is the only one that answers, in the beginning, origin, be with me at the right hand of God the Father, destiny, meaning we get through the entire life book itself. And morality we get through the commandments. We have an edict. All other worldviews answer some of this, not all of it. So when you look at this 3, 4, 5 grid, here's the fourth part. These are the 5 disciplines that every worldview needs to adjust to. Is there a God? Now, Christianity is the only one when if you take Christ out of it, it collapses. In Islam, if you take Muhammad out of it, Allah still remains. In Buddhism, if you take Buddha out of it, Nirvana still remains. Hinduism, you take any one God, you got 15 others. In Sikhism, you take out one guru, you have 9 others. In Jainism, you take, any of those others, if you take their primary figure out of it, the concept and the precept still survives. In Christianity, when you take Christ and the cross out of it, it collapses. When they say, what is so unique about your Christ? That's what's unique about our Christ. Because when they say, well, I can't believe God is 3 in 1. You don't check your shampoo. You agree when your shampoo is 3 in 1? Now you're saying, well, that's a ridiculous, childish argument. Well, maybe, but let me give it to you this way. Within the confines of business, when I look at business, when I look at corporate hierarchy, the people I put here in front of you are better than me in business and in corporate hierarchy. Sonny is a director with AT&T, assistant director with AT&T, a lifelong career in management. Brad with the history he has shared with you. Victor with his success. Wayne with his success that he'll share with you this afternoon. In headship in this room, in business, I'm inferior to them. But as human beings, we are equal on planet Earth. That's what 3 in 1 is. They are different in their headship because Christ seeds headship. He creates a person and he creates a persona. But they are same in being. They're different in essence. Otherwise, we would not. We're the only ones who have a holy counselor who is promised by us to be there with us till he comes again. God fully did, God fully was, and God will be again, but during this person. So we'll explain it a little further. Let's look at Holy Communion, ritual. Every one of them have rituals, but their rituals can never be explained the way we can explain our rituals. When Christ said, do this, present, as often as you can, present continuous. Until I come again, future. In one act, he fuses human history. 3 in 1, woman's womb. When she finds herself, she's pregnant for the very first time, 3 DNA in her body. Hers, the unborn child's the man. In the finitude of a womb, if we can see three in one, what can we not see in the infinitude of his own creation? That's how we have to explain it. So when you look at God, you look at the reality, the metaphysics of it, the knowledge, the epistemology we have, the morality, the commandments we are given, and humankind, the very anthropology that surrounds us, we begin to see a definitive thread. So when you look at the 3, 4, 5 that we build our argument around, we have a worldview that is logically consistent, it's empirically adequate, it's experientially relevant. We have four questions that we can answer. There is a beginning, there is an end, there is a purpose, and there is a morality. And then these 5 disciplines that guide us actually take over all of life. And there is nothing you can find in a human's quest that would be outside of this. Now I want you to take you to a more contemporary thinker who did not know why he was paraphrasing the Bible, Zig Ziglar. He would say, I'm paraphrasing the Bible. If you asked him point where it is, he wouldn't know. I really believe he was getting stuff that he had no idea he was getting. And I jokingly say that because after I started to parse his words, years after he had passed, I began to realize that the definitive genius behind them. He would say stuff like, everybody wants the same 8 things. To be happy, to be healthy, to be reasonably prosperous, to have friends, security, peace of mind, good family relationships, and hope. Now you take those 8 things and you put anything in this world that humanity wants, and you cannot be outside those 8. Same logic. So when you believe in something, do you believe it's outside of you? Or do you believe it is you? The New Age thinkers. You know, someone asked me, what's the definition, what's the difference between neuro-linguistic programming, which is mind control, and free will? And I always bring up this concept that the self-help world that I came out of, the motivation world that I came out of, was an $80 billion industry. And the irony is that the whole industry was built on other people telling you how to have self-help. If that is not the biggest oxymoron in the world, why do you need me to tell you you need self-help? Whereas in Jeremiah 33:3, to a lamenting prophet who was wanting to see if he was relevant during the exile, seek unto me and I will answer you and I will show you things that you cannot comprehend. God saying is, outside the realm of your imagination begins my countenance. Outside the realm of your imagination begins my countenance. So humanity is designed to dream, but the limit of our dream, where it ends, the limit of our want, the limit of our imagination is where God resides. Once we realize that, we can welcome him into our environments in a very different and very profound way. So what I wanted to give you this component as a backdrop as to why we use logic as the lens to not defeat an argument for the sake of being smart, but to counter the perspective from the people who think we're dumb. Huge difference. One time on a flight, a guy says, so you're one of those evangelists. I said, no, I don't know what you're talking about, but this is the one you got for the next 3 hours. You know, if you're going to lump me into whatever category, ball's back in your court, you better define what is that. He says, well, I've never had a good experience with them. I said, me neither. That's why I'm unique. You know, Billy Graham was so simple in all of his journeys. When Billy Graham was asked a question, he said, do you really believe that bunk about Jonah and a whale? He said, well, let me correct you. Biblically, it was a big fish. But that doesn't seem to be your main question. Your main question is, can I believe a miracle? He says, I do not look at the page and ask myself whether the miracle is valid. I look at my life as a result of those pages and ask myself, if tomorrow I opened it and it said, Jonah swallowed the whale, I wouldn't even blink. It's not the page, it's not the miracle, it's its outworking. How does that God appear in your life and guide you? Are you radically different? Mr. Ziegler used to say, earthquakes and hurricanes get all the publicity, termites do more damage. You can make radical changes in minute steps. Make radical changes in minute steps. When I first got saved, you know, my father wouldn't talk to me. He told me I was a curse on the family. If you're a son, can you imagine your father, whose primary job is to bless you, saying you're a curse on the family? And my wife said, I'm not going to get involved in this because I don't want him to think that you converted because of me. This is on you. So I'm there by my lonesome. They love her. They're not talking to me. And I'm struggling. And then I have this commandment. Make disciples of all nations. No, I got to make a disciple of this person, my dad. But I don't save, Christ saves. Brad's been in my parents' home. Victor's met my parents. We've honored them in everything we've done. We've flown them to different places. But it's hard when a father says you're a curse on the family and you still have to crawl into that environment because your Lord commands you to do that. Commands you. It's not a suggestion. Give it a shot, que sera, sera, and the great by and by, it'll all work out. Why should I call anybody? Just switch on the TV, Adrian Rogers, Jack Graham calling them by the thousands, we'll be all right. And then this last trip to India, they called me and said, hey, we heard your dad got his PhD. I said, yeah. He said, can we honor him? Said the Union Gospel Church, 10 minutes from where I was born. About 20 minutes from where my father said I was a curse. I was sitting on the altar behind my dad as they brought him to the front. And they put a ceremonial shawl around him and said, congratulations on this amazing achievement. My father's been a Hindu for all of his life, and not one Hindu ever called him into a temple to ask him to speak. And that church asked my father to speak. And my father stood up and said the words for the very first time. Is he where I need him to be? No. Are we a long way from me being a curse? Yes. Here's what he said. Thank you for your love, because I know Jesus is love. First time my father ever said the word Jesus was in a church, ordained by the Heavenly Father. Long before you were born, I set you apart, and I ordained you a prophet to the nations. Proof is on our side. Then my father paused and said, the two people I'd like to thank is the boy who's going to speak to you, who I can't wait to hear, because I learned from my son. But this boy had the rare privilege of buying both me and my grandson textbooks at the same time. A long way from you're a curse on the family. You know, when Brad said, listen, see, I think he always answers. I don't think we always listen. I think he answered me that day when my father said I was a curse, but I was so caught up in being called a curse. He didn't say, you have no idea, outside the realm of your imagination. Did I ever think when my father called me a curse and I was crying in that living room, said, Dad, I'm not a curse, I just became a Christian. Don't say that, I need your blessing. Did I ever think my father would stand in a church and say, Jesus is love? See, this is real, folks, if you just look at how God works in our lives.